Welcome to the European Study Center at the University of Pittsburgh's Conversation on Europe, on Uncertain Future, Elections in Europe and in the US. We are joined today by several institutional partners who are co-sponsoring this conversation. At Florida International University, we have the Jean Monnet European Union Center of Excellence, and Christine Cali-Sanchez, who is the coordinator, and Marcus Thiel, who is the director. At the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, we also have the Jean Monnet Center and their coordinators Sebnem Ozkan and Maxime Larive. Also joining us, actually that is all who are joining us remotely today. We want to thank the staff at the European Studies Center who helped put this together, Kate Bowersox, Ashley DiGregorio, and Liz Schlen. And I just want to also mention our next session, our next conversation, which will be Black Lives Matter, the Movement in Europe, which will be held Tuesday, November 15th. But today we are going to be talking about a very timely and relevant topic, which should generate lots of discussion. And we'll be focusing on elections in Europe and in the US as well. And just to sort of give us a brief introduction, today in Europe we couldn't be seeing more interesting things happening. We're seeing large mainstream parties struggling to stay relevant and a rise in support and electoral success of the far-right populist parties from France to the Netherlands to Austria and Hungary. We're also seeing the formation of new parties such as Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, and the Alternative for Germany party, which are attracting voters who have previously voted for the mainstream parties as well as new voters. These parties are also seeing success at the polls and are participating in governments at the subnational and national levels. At the heart of politics today in Europe are debates about immigration, identity, economics, and trade, as well as frustration with politics as usual. And in the US, we are also seeing a rise in populism in our own elections, especially as can be seen in our current presidential campaign. With this background, we turn to our experts to discuss recent developments and trends in both Western and Eastern Europe. And we are pleased to be joined today by three experts, one who is sitting next to me, and two who are joining us remotely. Miguel Simon, who is with us here, is a visiting scholar at the University of Pittsburgh European Studies Center. He has a PhD from the Universidad Complutense de Madrid. He has worked in the past for the federal executive of the Spanish Socialist Party and has advised various ministries in Spain. He has previously held visiting positions at Sciences Po in Paris and at the Autonomous University in Guerrero, Mexico. His research focuses on the radical right and populism in Europe. Next, we are joined by Jan Ravny, who is an assistant professor at the Centre d'études européennes at the Sciences Po in Paris. His PhD is from University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He is also currently a research fellow at the Center for European Research at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And his research focuses on party competition in Eastern Europe, party ideology, and party strategies. And finally, we are joined by Lawrence LeDuc, who is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. He holds a PhD from the University of Michigan. He has held visiting professor and research fellow positions at several institutions, including Florida State, the University of Amsterdam, Central European University, and Australian National University. In 2015, Professor LeDuc received the Mildred A. Schwartz Lifetime Achievement Award from the Canadian Politics section of the American Political Science Association. And his research focuses on political participation, electoral reform, and direct democracy. We're very happy to have all three experts participate in today's conversation. Thank you. So to get us started, I'd like to start with Professor LeDuc and to hear what your thoughts are about the most significant electoral trends that we're seeing in Western Europe today.
Well, I'm going to pick up a little bit on your introduction, Jae-Jae, and try to ask the question about what exactly we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of different things in different places, and there's a tendency to kind of overgeneralize them, I think, at this stage. Take one of the terms that was used in the introduction, the rise of far-right populism. Now, populism itself is a very tricky term to define, but we are seeing in Europe populist parties of the right and the left I'm sure Miguel, for example, will talk about Podemos. So I don't want to put those two things together. I want to sort of think of them separately. Yes, there are some gains by far right parties in certain countries and in some elections. There are populist trends in some places, but I'm not sure they're the same thing. And then, of course, because the American election's going on now, we tend to jump right there and say, oh, far right populism. But many American commentators have remarked how hard it is to place Trump ideologically. And the comparison, say, between Trump and Marine Le Pen, for instance, in France, I think is very limited, even though they're appealing to some of the same voters. So I hope maybe in the discussion as it develops, we'll talk about some of the variations in Europe between countries in terms of the ones that have already been mentioned or thought about, and also how far we can go with the comparisons between what's going on in the United States and what's going on in a number of the European cases. I'm speaking here from Canada, and at the moment we don't see any of those trends. And we had an election a year ago in which the smaller parties did rather poorly, and one of the most mainstream centrist parties swept back into power. So neither far right nor populist trends here in Canada.
So just to quickly follow up on that, obviously this is not a discussion on Canada, but I'd just like to hear your thoughts as to why that is, why the trends in Canada are not sort of mirroring what we're seeing in some other places.
I think I'm not sure I have a good answer to that question, because Canada is certainly not immune from some of the trends that we see elsewhere. In the election a year ago here in Canada, the Conservatives tested briefly a few of the Islamophobic kind of tendencies that you see in other countries. Didn't work very well for them. So one possibility is that the Canadian demographic is not all that receptive, at least right now, to that kind of politics. Canada's always had a fairly strong tradition of racial and ethnic and religious tolerance. And so trends like that sometimes don't work as well here as they might in a country where there are deeper divisions. Another reason, of course, is our electoral system. Our electoral system is not very friendly to small parties or to new parties. It's hard for them to break through, and it's hard for them to win seats because it's a British-style electoral system. So from time to time, a third party will get a number of votes, but often not do very well in terms of representation. And that tends to have the effect of causing people not to vote for it as readily as they might in some other systems. So in many of the European countries where you have proportional representation, you have a tradition of multi-party politics, I think it's easier for some of those trends to break through. So those would be two things that just occurred to me that I might mention that makes Canada a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Jan, I was wondering if you could jump in and give your sort of introductory thoughts about Eastern Europe and some of the trends that you're seeing, and if we can, and similarities, differences, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm actually going to suggest that what is happening in Eastern Europe is connected to very similar trends that we see in the West, in Western Europe, and potentially even in the United States. And I'd like to start by giving a little bit of a historical context to the rise of populism that you suggested, Jae-Jae, that we're seeing. I think the historical context should start around the late 1980s, when we saw two very fundamental developments. One was the relaunch of European integration in the late 80s, in the context of the Single European Act and later the Maastricht Treaty. And secondly, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. This ushered in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, a spread of liberal democratic principles. And these principles were not just limited to the traditional democratic principles like individual rights and civil liberties, but more deeper things like protection of minority rights or of minorities of all kinds and affirmative action of all kinds. So very broadly socially liberalizing trends of societies both in the East and in the West. Together with this also came international trade openness, both in the West and in the East, which we generally will call globalization. And all of these processes in Europe have been brought under a larger umbrella of European Union and European Union integration. This was also in the West as in the East. Now, after the economic crisis that we experienced in the last 5 to 6 years, We see a certain exhaustion, both of European integration and also of these liberalizing trends that we've experienced. And what we realize is that many individuals have not really shared in both the economic and the sociocultural achievements that we were experiencing. And these people feel economically and culturally threatened by globalization, and they turn to populist and various illiberal options. Now, I really feel that this fundamental dynamic is identical in the East as it is in the West. However, in the East, we see a much stronger populist or illiberal backlash. Why is this? Well, it's because the East has experienced a far more rapid and steeper change. The last 25 years have taken Eastern Europe from communist authoritarian regime into really liberal, democratic, economically open societies. Eastern Europe in general has traveled the same road much, much faster. And so as a result, the economic benefits and cultural changes have been enjoyed and absorbed by much smaller shares of the population.
So Miguel, I'm going to turn to you since you have the benefit of sitting next to me, and I thought maybe you could give your thoughts as well on some of these sort of broader trends that you're seeing in Europe.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think I'm not mistaken in saying that the next months and above all the next year will be probably the most important year for the European Union since its foundation, or at least from the last 50 years. Probably since the crisis of empty chair more than 50 years ago. And I say that because for example, today there is a lot of people talking about a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit, but I think that to fully understand what is happening and what can happen in the next months, we have to put everything in context. And if you look forward, we have at the beginning of December, we have the postponed elections in Austria, and there is a very high possibility for a party, an Eurosceptic party, winning that election. And if we go to the next year, in March we have elections in Netherlands, and the Freedom Party is leading the polls, and they have announced that if they win that election, they will propose a referendum like Brexit in the United Kingdom, and let's see what happens in that election. And then in April we have elections also in France, and now Marine Le Pen and the National Front are leading the polls. The French electoral system is not very, we don't know if Marine Le Pen is going to win the election, but in any case, some days ago she said that, for example, that the state nation is come back, and the time for the strong borders has come back, and in any case he's also in favor of a referendum in France to exit the European Union. What I mean is that maybe the next year will be decisive for the European Union, and actually in that moment there were what we can see, if you see the data in Eurobarometer, and what you can see is that the Euroscepticism is on the rise, and it's gaining a political momentum, and every one of them reinforce the other one. I can put an example. In 2000, at the beginning of this century, in Austria, Jae-Jae, the leader from the Freedom Party, won the election. He was supposed to be the next chancellor of Austria, or at least to be in the government coalition. But at that time, the European Union was strong enough to prevent that, and Jae-Jae never was in the government or in the government coalition. In this moment, today, a situation like that is probably impossible, because let's say, for example, that the Party of Freedom won the election in Netherlands in the next March, and they say we are going to do another referendum to go out of the European Union. They have probably allies, maybe in Poland, maybe in Bulgaria, maybe in Hungary. who knows, maybe in France or in England. What I mean is that they are not, now is the European Union is not so strong as 15 years ago. So, in my opinion, it's the most important period for the European Union since its formation.
So, Professor LeDuc, I want to come back to something you said at the beginning, which is that we want to be careful of making generalizations. And so I wonder if you could perhaps talk a little bit why we see such differences, and we aren't seeing the same sorts of things happening across the European Union, across member states.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about, Jae-Jae, and I can pick up on something that Miguel just said because I was glad he brought up Austria. And the Freedom Party, of course, has been around for quite a while in Austria. It's not a new party. And so therefore, its history goes back a ways. And if we're talking about new parties or small parties, it's a different sort of example because it's become more established in Austrian politics. Now, one of the things I want to try to do is distinguish between what I call in my work protest voting and voting simply for far-right parties or populist parties. Now, sometimes they're the same thing. The same thing, because if that party is there, people will choose it as an option for quite different reasons. Some are ideologically in line with it. Some are choosing it simply because it is the most convenient protest vehicle in that given election, in that given place. Now, Austria, of course, right now, its government is a grand coalition. And so is Germany's government. Now, that really opens the door to that kind of politics because if for any substantial period of time, you have a government which is a coalition of left and right, or a coalition of both mainstream parties, what option does that leave the voter who is unhappy with the status quo? In a normal kind of politics, you get some alternation between those parties, and the party that is out of power might pick up at least some of those votes. But when you have a grand coalition, as in Austria, and Austria's had that for a while now, protest voting gravitates toward whatever option is convenient, and that convenient option is the Freedom Party. Also, the presidential election in Austria is separate from the parliamentary election, so control of the government is not at stake in that election. And that also makes that election a convenient protest vehicle. The same sort of voting patterns that you often see in European Parliament elections, or that you sometimes see in referendums, which I think we're going to talk about at some point in this conversation as well. Now, it's interesting, if I just shift for a second there from using Austria as my example to Germany, guess what kind of a government Germany has right now and has had for some time? A grand coalition. So it's not too surprising there to see the rise of the AfD, because the AfD, given the kind of issues that it emphasizes, is again a convenient protest vehicle. Now, it also does represent a strain of thinking. I don't want to minimize that, because it is on the right. It does use anti-immigrant rhetoric. It is Eurosceptic. Which is a new strain in German politics, more recent vintage. But nevertheless, it is positioned to simply attack the political establishment. And who is the political establishment? It's basically the CDU and the SPD working together in government, as they have done now for a number of years, under a chancellor who's been in power for some time. So that the field is well set up in those countries for protest politics. If we move away from those cases, that sort of vote may gravitate elsewhere to a different cluster of parties, or sometimes to a more established opposition.
Well, and I think in the case of Austria especially, the fact that we're seeing this in the presidential election when Austria is semi-presidential at best, but effectively parliamentary, right? We're not seeing this in the parliamentary elections, but effectively in a second order venue or something we may refer to in that respect.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you used the term second order, because Austria, the presidential election, isn't exactly a second order election, but it's a different scale because power is not at stake. And it has been used in past Austrian elections as a convenient way of protesting against whoever's in power at that time. And a fringe candidate can pick up more votes there, just as happens in European Parliament elections on a fairly regular basis throughout Europe.
And so we're seeing, perhaps not a second order, but one that is not at the same level of importance of the national.
Yeah, it has some of those elements. It's not exactly second order, but it has some of those same elements.
I absolutely agree. I think that the most important point is the Netherlands election in March, and then we will see in France. But yeah, the most important point, the most important election is the parliamentary election in Netherlands.
Yeah, and I think the presidential, which is a couple months after that, to see what happens with in France. As Marine Le Pen, I looked this morning, is currently polling at about 30% of voters if the election was today. Jan, I wonder if you could follow up a bit, and sorry, you're also, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sitting here in France. I figured I should say something about the upcoming French election.
Yes.
As a foreigner in France, I should be very concerned about the rise of Marine Le Pen, and I certainly am. But at the same time, you mentioned the role of electoral systems, and the electoral system that Marine Le Pen is facing is such that the likelihood of her victory is extremely, extremely slim. I believe, and my colleagues here who are specialists on French politics believe, that it would really take a very fundamental exogenous shock, probably much larger than the one we've had with the terrorist attacks, for her to be able to win in the second round. So what is largely expected is that Marine Le Pen will pass into the second round of the presidential election, where she will likely face a candidate of the right. At this point, it seems like that candidate will be Alain Juppé, who is a person very acceptable to mainstream left-wingers as well. And that candidate will very, very easily win the second round. So I think the likelihood of a Marine Le Pen presidency is close to zero.
Which, of course, is interesting because that's effectively replaying the 2002 election in France.
Yes, absolutely.
With her father. For slightly different reasons, that we ended up with a runoff that was exactly the same, in which the election was won very handily by the
She has tried very hard to change the face of the party. She has tried very hard to become a moderate and sort of be seen as an acceptable political actor who could be potentially a president. But it is very clear to still a vast majority of the French that is not the case, and the Front National is an extreme party. I've been still struck by the fact, reading the various media outputs of the Front National, how much moderate they actually do seem to be. And it strikes me very much in comparison with Donald Trump that, I mean, he makes Marine Le Pen look like a very mainstream conservative candidate.
Lawrence? Yeah.
I agree with everything Jan just said, except I wanted to pick up on his very last point, and that is that the likelihood of her victory was close to zero. I'd be a bit careful with the close to zero scenario, partly because the polling suggests she'll make the runoff. Okay, and of course that's what happened. That happened once before with her father, who got into the runoff and lost very badly. So that is certainly the most likely scenario. But if we pick up on some of these broader themes of European politics that we've been discussing, the sort of anti-establishment framing of an election, the electoral system then begins to work for her rather than against her, because once she makes the runoff, she will be positioned against an establishment candidate, whether it be the current president from the left or someone from the Gaullist side. And so the election then becomes framed not as a left-right contest, as is more common in France, but as an establishment versus anti-establishment candidate. And it's hard to tell exactly in the current climate, I think, in Europe, exactly how that will play out. It may not play out exactly as it did in 2002, the previous time.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I mean, she will definitely come much closer than her father did if she makes the runoff. Yes. But I do still believe that there will be significant mobilization in France against the more deeper radical right history of the party. And I think that will still be able to mobilize more than 50% of the voters.
Yeah. And there's, of course, a risk of incidents occurring, in that time frame that are unpredictable. So
Absolutely.
I'm very cautious these days on election predictions.
Yes.
I would like to come back for a while to something that Professor Lawrence and Jan Rovny have put on the table, is the idea of populism, because actually for me it's studying these new trends in European or Western politics is a real headache, because the point is that if Bernie Sanders is a populist but Trump is a populist, if Podemos is a populist, is a populist party, and Marine Le Pen is also a populist politician. So we find, I think we find a very real limit to understand the content. I mean, there is obvious differences between Sanders and Trump, or for example, between Syriza or between Podemos and Marine Le Pen, ideological content. And so what I find is a limit, always to try to understand these new trends in politics in Europe with this concept of populism and to deal with this new phenomenon. I don't know what you think about it.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because we're seeing sort of the populism on both the right and the left, and what seems to be attracting voters is not ideology, but it's populism.
Yeah, for some people say that is just a new style of politics. Some other people say that, for example, LeDuc say that it has a content, ideological content, and there is a difference between populism from the left and populism from the right. But if you try to understand, for example, the new parties in Europe, for example, the National Front has a strong ideological background, and it's not the case from Donald Trump here. It's not the case from, for example, some years ago, Berlusconi, who was a very typical populist. And there are a lot of differences between different parties that we cannot discard from the concept of populism.
Yeah, absolutely. Jan?
Yeah, thanks. I think that ideology matters in the context of this populism. I think what we're seeing in very broad terms is we see a success of the radical right, of the anti-immigrant, very ideological anti-immigrant, anti-other tone of ideology in the north of Europe. And that is the part of Europe that has done reasonably okay in the economic crisis. In the south of Europe, what we see is the success of left-wing populism, of Podemos, of Syriza, who are left-wing parties. They're stealing thunder from the communists in Greece, for example. And these are obviously the countries who have struggled very much and suffered quite a bit economically in the last 5 to 6 years. And so these divides are clearly tinting the color of populism, which is likely to be attractive.
Yeah. And Jae-Jae, I would add to what Jan just said. The economic climate is a big factor here, and that already came up in points that people have made earlier. And when I was a visiting professor in Budapest, it was at the time of Hungary's accession to the European Union, and people were enormously optimistic at that time. And when I went back, even just a few years after that, there was a lot of pessimism that had already set in, because Europe had not delivered the prosperity that many Hungarians just expected would come with membership in the EU. So not only did the economic climate feed into discontent with the political establishment, it also fed into the Eurosceptic kind of climate that developed, I think, in more recent years. So if you put those two things together, the weak or stagnant economies in a number of different countries, with the promise, particularly to the newer members of the EU, that Europe seemed to bring, you can see why there would be considerable discontent in countries like Southern and Eastern Europe.
Yeah, if you see, for example, the data, you can see a very visual difference between the north or the center of Europe and the south of Europe. The main concerns, if you look at the Eurobarometer, what you find is that in the middle Europe and in the north of Europe, the economical factors are lowering. And now, since 13 up to date, they are lowering. And now the main concerns are immigration and terrorism. But in the south, in Spain or in Greece, the socio-economical problems are the main important. So I agree with Professor Lawrence that there is a lot of factors to keep in mind, and one of them is globalization, the theory of the losers of globalization. Another one is, as for example, some weeks ago, put on the table Ronald Ingerhard and Pippa Norris in a very good paper, is the cultural thing, the immigration, the globalization versus traditional nationalism. There's a lot of factors. Maybe it's the moment for we could say a perfect storm for the rising of these new parties.
Yeah.
Thank you. I've set out this idea that economy matters a lot. I would now like to moderate it by saying it does not explain everything, right? Poland is a very interesting case in point. What we've actually seen in Eastern Europe is the divide of Eastern Europe into those who are very prosperous. Poland did not have an economic crisis. Poland never had negative growth during the last period. And yet they have elected a conservative, questionably government and have turned against the EU. So prosperity has been very much in place in some countries in Central and Eastern Europe, like the Czech Republic. There is a shortage of labor in these countries. They need migrants that they are rejecting. At the same time, they are turning conservative. So I think there really is something to this idea of a conservative backlash against the last 20, 25 years of liberalization. That is somewhat independent from the economic story.
I think this is a very important point, because, for example, in Poland, they go to the right. Now they have the government of the Kaczynski party, but they were growing 4%. So they were doing, and the economy was doing really, really well. And in Austria, for example, they didn't have a very strong economical crisis. They didn't suffer the level of unemployment as another country, but it doesn't prevent a lot of people to go to protests or radical right parties or So the economical factor, we have to keep it in mind, but I think that doesn't explain everything.
Yeah,
I like the Polish example and the way that Jan just framed it, because it is different in terms of the economy. But note also that Law and Justice Party is not the same thing as the National Front or Syriza in Greece. So there has been an alternation of governments in Poland between the two larger parties. There are other fringe parties and groups that contest elections, but I think we have to be careful about these cross-party comparisons. Even in Hungary with Fidesz, Fidesz had been in power before, and then was out of power for a while, and then came back. And Orban is the sort of politician who tacks more to the left or more to the right, depending on what the electoral climate is like and what sort of opposition he is facing. So the minute Jobbik began to make some serious gains in Hungarian elections, you began to see a politician like Orban try to tack to the right and make it more difficult for a party like Jobbik to really break through. So I think we have to make a distinction between cases where there is an rapidly up and coming new party, or fringe party of the right, or a force of the far right, like the National Front in France, and the more normal politics, with kind of normal in quotes, of countries like Hungary or Poland, where you've seen some shifting between the left and the right, and politicians in power who are fairly good at managing that kind of politics, at least in the short term.
I want to jump in. We have a question from one of our viewers about this idea of protest voting and protest parties. And so, Larry, since you first mentioned it in terms of research you're doing, if you want to maybe start talking a bit about how you think about or how you're defining protest voting as opposed to ideological voting, go from there.
Well, protest party, like populist party, is a term that covers almost too much ground to make it useful. But I think of it as a party placed in a particular context. So I was using, for my example earlier, I was using the context of the Grand Coalition in Germany or Austria, where that closes off a lot of normal sources of political opposition or opportunities for voters to express discontent of one kind or another. And so a party in that situation, it might be a new party like AfD in Germany, or it might be an established party like Freedom Party in Austria. They are positioned to pick up votes from people who are expressing discontent with the current political climate, because they say it doesn't matter if we put the left in power or we put the right in power, we get the same thing. In the U.S. case, which came up in the earlier discussion, running against Washington is a time-honored strategy in American politics. I mean, Trump didn't invent it, and others before him, both from the political mainstream, either the Democratic or the Republican Party, or candidates of various factions like the Tea Party, have been doing this for years. And so, and the current climate in the U.S. is also very amenable to that kind of politics, because it isn't a coalition as you see in Austria, but it is certainly a case where we've had a Democratic president for the last 8 years and a Republican Congress for most of that time. So it's very, very hard for the Republicans, who have controlled both houses of Congress more recently, to pretend that they are not the political establishment. It opens the door then to a candidate using that anti-Washington and anti-establishment rhetoric, saying a plague on both your houses. You know, you people, whoever you are, have been in power now, and to use Trump's language, you never do anything. That's a kind of a populist appeal, but it's also, I think, picking up protest votes by people who figure that the Republicans and the Democrats in Washington are simply part of the same lot, even though they may differ ideologically on it.
So we have a follow-up question from an audience member. If you include economic considerations into this category of protest voting, or if it really is sort of an anti-system vote?
Could be either, but I think the two things are often connected. I think Miguel earlier made reference to a perfect storm, where you have several of these things coming together at once. So, you know, if you have a slow growth economy or stagnant wages, or as are the case in North America these days, or high unemployment as you have in Southern Europe, there are a lot of economic factors that are driving protest. And then if you combine that with a government that's been in power for a while, or a coalition that includes, you know, more than one of the mainstream political factions, I think that just opens the door to people who, like Trump, claim that nothing's working. It doesn't matter who we put in power. You're all part of the same lot that have been there before and can't really solve these problems that we face. So it's definitely got an economic side.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Jan, I want to come to you and turn to Hungary for a bit and talk about some of the things that have been going on there. So just as a bit of background, the recent referendum on accepting the EU's migrant quotas, and over 98% of Hungarians rejected it. Turnout was quite low, but that's still a very impressive number, of course, among those that voted. More interestingly, although the government under Orban initiated the referendum, they actively campaigned against the referendum. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what's going on. What's going on in Hungary? Why such, you know?
I wanted to come back to Hungary. Hungary is in some ways, at least the pattern is somewhat similar and somewhat repeated in Poland. Now, Hungary has gone much further down the line than Poland has. And I would actually suggest that the currently governing parties in Hungary and Poland, PIS in Poland and Fidesz in Hungary, are in ways becoming more radical and potentially more dangerous than the so-called radical right in the West. So I don't agree that this is politics as usual. What is happening in these countries is an attempt, and at times successful attempt, to limit constitutional courts, and successful attempt to limit or even close opposition media outlets. This is not illiberal, this is simply undemocratic. So this is not politics as usual, and we don't know what Marine Le Pen would do if in power, but this is not what she's suggesting. So this is going beyond. So it's an obvious reversal of the democratic gains that we have seen in that part of the world in the last 25 years. Both Hungary and Poland have very interesting patterns of competition. They're quite atypical in a certain way. The two right-wing parties, that is Fidesz and PiS, are actually among the most left-leaning economically in the party system. That is kind of irrelevant because competition does not really occur in these systems over economic issues, but over cultural issues. So what really tends to drive competition, decision-making of voters at the polls in these countries, are considerations over the openness of society, nationalism, and in the context of Poland, Christianity. So what PIS is really a Christian national party, Fidesz is really a nationalist party. The flagship policy of Fidesz has been giving citizenship to extraterritorial Hungarians. The flagship policy of PIS, which has then been retrenched recently, has been the attempt to limit abortion rights that are already very limited in Poland. So competition in these countries is very much cultural. What we've seen in both countries is the effect collapse of the liberal opposition. And these were the old socialist parties. Both have collapsed in the mid 2000s in an aftermath of corruption scandals. And this has been this has given a lot of space for these conservative parties to gain power and to hold on to power. Now, Mr. Orban, who has come to power in 2006, if I remember correctly, with a constitutional majority, has changed the constitution a number of times, tweaking the electoral system in various ways to improve his possibilities. And as Professor LeDuc has mentioned, he has also very much attempted to limit his right-wing competitor. So now the only opposition in Hungary is an outright white quasi-neo-fascist party, Jobbik. And Viktor Orban is trying to outflank it through various measures like the referendum that you have mentioned. Now, the referendum comes in the aftermath of a major migration crisis that you've certainly all heard about, which has seen hundreds of thousands of people pass through Europe and many of them through Hungary. This is unprecedented and unknown in Eastern Europe. We haven't seen since the World War such large movements of people, and suddenly the possibility that these people might settle in Central Eastern Europe. And these people are, of course, of quite different origin. They're Arabs, Muslims, and that is quite a different situation for these countries. So that has raised a number of fears, and these politicians have very tactically and skillfully used this migration crisis to strengthen their position, to create really hysteria of anti-immigrant sentiments in countries that have an extremely minor numbers of any kind of ethnic minorities. In fact, Poland and Hungary are very, very ethnically homogeneous. Right? They have very small numbers of Muslims. Yet we see demonstrations against Muslims. And in this context, Viktor Orban decided to have this referendum, which really was a political tactic aimed against his right-wing competitor, the extremist Jobbik party. The referendum actually, I would argue, was quite an embarrassment. Now, it turns out that 98% of those who voted in favor of the referendum, which would limit immigration and which would oppose the European Union's ability to impose quotas. But it turns out that the turnout was only 42%, and so it is actually not legally binding. That has been a major embarrassment. Viktor Orban has put a lot of money into that campaign for the referendum, and this low turnout has, I'd say, hit him over the fingers. So it shows that there is some hope for the very fragmented opposition and liberalism in Hungary that I would say has gone off the rails.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Professor LeDuc, I wonder if you could jump in and give us your thoughts about the referendum in terms of what it's telling us in Hungary with the turnout.
I agree with virtually everything that Jan just said. I think he gave a very cogent explanation of why the referendum took place and what Orban thought he was trying to accomplish in doing this. And as he said, it was a bit of an embarrassment that it was low turnout. He was also trying to, of course, improve his strategic position in potential negotiations with the European Union about resettlement of refugees. And I think that was also one of the drivers of the referendum in terms of why he had it and why the question was so loaded. He didn't want to take any chance that the vote, however it turned out, would suggest that there was division. So if you read the question, it was almost impossible not to find something in there that people could support. I think also the way go back to what Jan was discussing earlier about comparing Poland and Hungary, and then some of the other cases that we've already discussed. This really emphasizes to me the importance of these national differences. It shows us how important religion is, for example, as a dimension of this divide in Poland, how important ethnography is in the divisions that exist in Hungary. And we could go right around the European map and highlight some of those national differences. It is true that certain types of parties in some countries are using some of the same rhetoric, might be anti-Islam or anti-immigrant rhetoric or nationalism in various forms. But these national differences really frame that quite differently. And it isn't always the same parties or the same types of parties that draw advantage from that. Now, I agree with also with what Jan said about Poland and the fact that corruption scandals were an important factor in the demise of the previous social democratic government. But corruption scandals are relatively short-term things in politics. Yes, they may cause certain leaders to get thrown out of office, but parties under those circumstances generally are able to renew themselves. New leaders come along, and the corruption scandals stick for a while in politics, but then you move on. And often you will find, if you take a little longer time frame of 2 or 3 electoral cycles, you will sometimes find those same parties back in power eventually once the scandals are out of the way or seem like ancient history. So I think there's a difference between a party that gets defeated because of a scandal or the economy, which we were talking about earlier, a weak economy, and it's punished for economic performance, and a genuine ideological shift. And I think, we want to be careful in analyzing the European cases to distinguish the one from the other, because if we're seeing things that are corrected over 1 or 2 election cycles and produce political change that is more cyclical, that is very different from a linear trend toward a particular type of party or a particular ideological configuration that may be something we haven't seen before.
Mm-hmm. So, speaking of politics, not as usual, Miguel, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in Spain. Spain has been going through an interesting period in its party politics, a country that was long dominated by 2 parties, the People's Party and the Socialist Party, now has really become a multi-party system, which has led to a protracted government negotiation process. Miguel, if you perhaps could tell us a little more about that and sort of what's happening and what's at the root of this.
Yeah, well, to put it a little in context, the People's Party actually and the Socialist Party in the history of Spanish democracy have reached an average of 80% of votes. And now they hardly have 50% of votes. I think that to understand that what is happening, we have to go back to the beginning of the crisis. At that moment in Spain, the unemployment rate was 7%, and in less than 3 years, it skyrocketed to more than 20%, actually to 24%. At that moment, the president of Spain, Zapatero, was from the Socialist Party, and he has the socialist government has to take very hard measures of cutting social spender, pushed very strong by the European Union. So then we went to the 2011 elections, and the Socialist Party lost the election. The People's Party won that election. The Socialist Party, we can say that with this cutting of social budget provoked a very strong unrest in their own political basis. So we had the People's Party government since 2011, but it's very with a lot of corruption scandals. So the social unrest started to rise really fast, and it opened a very wide space for new parties. The situation now is, we have elections 10 months ago, and from the more or less 2-party system, we go, as you have very well said, to 4 parties. We have the winner 10 months ago was the People's Party. The second party was the Socialist Party. We have a third party from the left, Podemos, and we have another 4th party from the center-right, Ciudadanos. The point is that, I'm talking about 10 months ago. The point is that in the Spanish political culture, it was the first time that people doesn't know who's going to be the next president, with what program. And in the Spanish political culture, we are not very used to this kind of negotiation between different parties. And well, they start the negotiation, and the point is that every party veto the other party. So, for example, we can imagine that the Popular People's Party tried to form a government, but the Socialist Party said, no, we are not going to form a government with the People's Party, and Podemos said, we are not going to form a government. So the Socialist Party tried to form a government with Podemos, and the Ciudadanos say, no, we are not going to form a government with, I mean, there is a lot of cross vetoes, so we have to win to another election, second election. It was 4 months ago, but the situation was the same. So we had two possibilities, to go to a third election or to form a government of the People's Party with Ciudadanos and with the abstention of the Socialist Party. So the ball went to the Socialist Party, and with what happened in the Socialist Party 2 weeks ago was that the party divided, split in two. One of them, led by the General Secretary, Pedro Sánchez, said, we are not going to abstain, we don't want the People's Party government in any case. But the other half of the Socialist Party, led by some local, regional, very strong regional leaders, said, we prefer the abstention. Spain needs a government, and we prefer a People's Party government with the abstention of the Socialist Party. And they forced the resignation of the General Secretary, and in this moment, what we know for sure is that probably in 2 weeks we will have a government. But the point is that it's a very weak government. So the point from now on is the stability of the government in Spain. For example, in 1 month or 1 month and a half, the parliament has to pass the budget for the next year. So the People's Party will need to start again a negotiation with the Socialist Party, with Podemos, with Ciudadanos to pass the budget. So it's a very unknown situation in Spanish politics, and we will see how to deal with it. But the problem is going to be the stability of the government.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think caused this, right? Because since the democratization in the late 70s, right, it was single party government for the most part, support with some of the smaller regional parties, but it went back between Pepe, the conservatives, PSOE, the socialists, and then all of a sudden there was clearly a change. So would you say this is economics, protest voting that we've talked about?
I think that both of them. I think that in the Spanish case, the most important thing was economical wealth, the beginning of the crisis. If you see at the first term of the Socialist Party with the President Zapatero, he was really very popular. But it plunged, the popularity of the President and the Socialist Party started to plunge when they have to pass in the parliament these social cut measures. It really went down, and it opened a space on its left to another party, and it was Podemos. It was then you remember the movements on the street, the 15M and all these kind of protest movements, and it opened that space on the left, and on the left of the Socialist Party. On the other side, the problem for the Popular Party was a lot of the scandals of corruption, very strong scandals of corruption involving all the levels of the Popular Party. And if you and the crisis goes on, and the economical crisis goes on, so it opened another space on the right, and is that space what is now occupying Podemos and Ciudadanos.
Either of you, Professor LeDuc, go ahead.
I think the Spanish case, as Miguel just very nicely explained it to us, can tell us a little bit about some of the other cases as well, particularly with respect to the role of the economy. And if you look back over a couple of electoral cycles, at the time of the 2008-09 economic crisis, a large number of governing parties were defeated in Europe. It didn't really matter too much who they were or where they were. If you had the misfortune to be presiding over government at the time that the economic crisis hit, you were either out of power a year later, or else if you hung on, your control was very severely reduced. You were punished, in other words, just for being in that place at that time. Now that's happens often in politics as you get economic cycles and parties, the crisis may or may not be their fault, but they're there, and that's what the voters are going to see when they go to the polls to vote. And if there's an alternative party well positioned to take advantage of that, they will often do well. But the difference, I think, in the current setting in Europe is the economic stagnation has gone on and on and on. And so if you threw a government out in 2008, 2009, and someone else came to power, and then they end up presiding over an economy with high unemployment, stagnant wages, other kinds of problems that are traceable to economic roots, what do voters then come to think when they go to the polls again in the next electoral cycle or the one after that, that their conclusion is none of these parties can fix these problems or deal with them. And in that kind of setting, they're more likely to turn to some of these new parties or parties that are outside of that traditional mainstream. So I think, to use the Japanese term, if you have a lost decade in economic terms, that's 2 or 3 electoral cycles. And I think it produces a different kind of political turnover than you would get if you had simply a recession and then a recovery from it, that whoever came to power could then ride the recovery and maybe be politically more secure for 1 or 2 electoral cycles. That hasn't happened hardly anywhere in Europe.
Yeah, I have something to add because when we study these new parties and these new trends in politics, we tend to focus, obviously, with reason, in the new parties. But I think that in Spain, at least, it's remarkable. But for example, in Austria, the 2 main traditional parties has collapsed. In Greece, the Socialist Party has almost disappeared. In Spain, it's remarkable that the 2 main traditional parties resist. I mean, they are losing votes. They have lost. In addition, they have lost 3% of votes. But the People's Party is the first party, and the Socialist Party is the second party. They are close. The gap is narrowing very fast, but after a lot of years of crisis, they have resisted, and it's remarkable also. I mean, this is a difference from another countries like Greece and Austria, because the economic crisis in Spain was really and keeps being really, really hard.
Yeah.
But I think something that we can say that we're seeing across the board is that the big mainstream parties, the socialists, conservatives, wherever they may be, are not being responsive, right? Whether it's on economic issues, whether it's on immigration, whether it's on whatever issue it may be, but there's a space that's being opened either on the right or on the left, in many of these countries that we've talked about. Different issues, different, specifics, but, this idea of parties not being responsive, and it's leaving that sort of space open to be filled by these parties that some may last and others may not, right? So I think that's obviously what we'll be seeing in the future. So I want to sort of think for a minute about, and if whoever wants to jump in on this question. So I think we are seeing these trends that we've been talking about to some degree, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Northern Europe, Southern Europe. But there are a few places where we really aren't seeing these trends. We aren't seeing a change in the parties. We aren't seeing a change in what voters are actually doing. Portugal is an example that comes to mind. And there are others that as well. And I just wonder if any of you have thoughts as to where we aren't seeing these new parties on the right, on the left, losses of votes by the mainstream parties, why we may not be seeing that in some of these places.
Oh, that sounds like a question for me, but I'm not sure I have a good answer.
Sorry, sort of throwing you a curveball here.
Yeah, well, the theme, of course, the theme of the discussion so far is that we are seeing a lot of the same things.
Right.
So if we have a couple of outliers where we're not seeing it, we have to think about why that may be. Now, the electoral system is often a factor. I think there are considerable variations from one country to another in terms of how easy it is for a new party to break through. Germany is a convenient example with the 5% threshold. AFD didn't break through the last time because it came just short of 5%, but it probably will the next time meet the 5% threshold. And that's a pretty significant barrier because below 5%, it's just a player on the stage, but really has no real role in politics after the election is over. Above 5%, it gets a block of seats and then has some staying power, at least through that electoral cycle. So, institutional variations matter. We have to look at each case. We were talking about Austria earlier because it has a presidential election. So having an elected president gives voters a vehicle to express some discontents with the system. In countries where there is no elected president, for instance, then they don't have that option available. Some countries have had referendums, and we know that referendums are often a vehicle for expressing political protest. They are sometimes a vehicle that is used by a small party or a new party to make its mark, to go out there and campaign on one side of a referendum question, even if it's not particularly relevant to them. We may see this in Italy. We haven't talked about Italy much as yet, but the referendum in December is going to be very much like this. If you look at the referendum, you say, well, what is that about? It's about an institutional change that Renzi wants to try to make. It doesn't look like it has anything to do with these broader issues that we're talking about, the economy, immigration, Euroscepticism, and so on. Yet all of those things are going to be in there because parties like the Five Star are going to be out there hammering those issues and attacking Renzi's referendum proposal, even though it's irrelevant. Well, part of the reason for that is, of course, the referendum is there. So it's a vehicle for those parties to establish themselves, to build support, and to use them as a stepping stone toward the next election. We see that also in German state-level politics, where there is no national election yet in Germany, not till next year. But in the meantime, you have elections in the Länder, in which parties are really fighting the next national campaign. But at the Land level, they're using that as a vehicle to try to establish themselves for future gains. The National Front has been doing this in France for years, of course. It does well in local or regional elections in many cases, also does better in European Parliament elections, but it's got its eye on the presidential election down the road. So it depends a little bit on the electoral system. It depends also a little bit on what electoral opportunities voters have to express these kinds of feelings. In some countries, they have more opportunities than they do in others. And I think we tend to pay attention to the ones where there's simply more going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wonder if you have any thoughts in the East European countries where we've talked about Hungary, we've talked about Poland, but there are also, countries where we aren't seeing these same sorts of trends. If there's anything specific to these countries in Eastern Europe that might explain why we aren't seeing some of these same trends.
To be honest, I really don't have a take on this, and I agree with Professor LeDuc that these are outliers. Now, what is an interesting lesson from Eastern Europe, and maybe become more relevant in Western Europe as we see the rise of these protest, populist, small parties coming into power or close to power. In Eastern Europe, we have seen this over a longer period of time. We've seen a lot of turnover in some countries, but what seems to be the case, some of my colleagues have studied this in greater depth, is that once these populist parties appear and start getting into government or into parliament, that will not end. Very soon you will realize that these populists who claim to clean up government and to take care of the corrupt practices or to get rid of the traditional elites will suddenly become the traditional elites themselves. And the next party will come along in 4 or 5 years and say, well, now we're going to clean up government from the guys who didn't clean up the government. And so we will actually get into these spirals of instability, at least within a part of the political spectrum, that will see the replacement of new parties explicitly campaigning as new parties, which is obviously very bad for democratic representation, because these parties are not there to be responsible for things the next time around.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's
go
a very good point, Jan. And protest parties are good vehicles for protest. But when they
Right.
come to power or join a governing coalition, the whole game changes completely, both from their point of view and from the point of view of the voters. The Freedom Party was in part of a governing coalition in Austria a number of years ago. It was a disaster, because they simply were trying to be the anti-government party within the government. And how can you make that work and convince people to keep supporting you? Same thing happened in the Netherlands to the four-town list. That's going even further back, a protest party that essentially was brought into the coalition in an attempt to try to, limit them. And then, of course, it all fell apart. So I think they have a limited shelf life. In other words, they can be protest vehicles as long as people want to use them that way. But electing them to something, then it either makes them part of the political establishment, or else it makes them a total failure, and they carry that failure with them through the next one or two or three electoral cycles. Sometimes even it causes the party itself to collapse, perhaps be reborn in a different form or under a different name.
And we have to also remember too that there are these protest parties that that sort of collapse, that they're really electoral parties, right? That they can't even get themselves into parliament, and they make a big splash, attract a lot of voters that are frustrated, let's say, but then can't actually, because of the electoral rules, other institutional features, can't actually get themselves into parliament. And so they are even stopped before they get in, or if they get in, there's lots of historical examples of this as well, of protest parties that get into parliament and then effectively just sort of crash and burn because they were a protest party. They were protesting the system, they were protesting politics as usual, and now that they have to participate, they don't have the tools to do that. So that's another interesting possibility of what could happen. So perhaps we can, as we're sort of getting towards the end of our time here, I sort of threw you all a curveball and said, why aren't we seeing this everywhere? And so perhaps now we can kind of come to the other side of that, which is to say, are these trends that we've talked about a blip? Or are we really going to see a change in politics as we know it in Europe, right? Are these parties going to change the nature of party systems, the nature of issues, the nature of voting, all of these kinds of things? Or is this a temporary blip in some places, and that, as we say in two-party systems in the U.S., like in the U.S., we'll sort of settle back down to politics as usual, with the mainstream parties being the major points of contention. So whoever wants to jump in, perhaps, and start on that question.
Well, it's more than a blip. I think we can at least say that, because this has been going on for a while now, and it's been going on, as we've noted in the discussion so far, in a number of different places. So even though I've been trying to emphasize the national differences and the variations, I certainly wouldn't use a term like blip to describe it. It's certainly, some of the movements we're seeing have some staying power, and the sources of the protest are not going away. Whether it's the economy, whether it's concerns about immigration, whether it's protest of other particular issues in a given country, I think we are seeing some tendency that way. Anti-establishment rhetoric, anti-establishment parties, populist, if you wanted to use that term. The question of how long it will last is hard to say. To some extent, corrections are built in, but they may take a while to be realized. But I think we shouldn't overgeneralize, but we also shouldn't be dismissive either, that we are seeing something. Just to go to we haven't talked about the American election very much as yet, and since it's going on right now, I thought maybe I'd throw an example from there. We don't really know what the aftermath is going to be. On the one hand, Trump looks a lot like a phenomenon that's going to come and go, and maybe a couple of years from now it will be a kind of a footnote. But at the same time, it looks like it is very destabilizing for the Republican Party. And if the Republican Party falls apart as a result of this election, or takes one or two or three electoral cycles before it's able to get itself back into a competitive position again nationally, that will be a major development. So, it's not a blip, But on the other hand, whether some of these shorter term things that we're seeing translate into longer term or fundamental change of parties or levels of political competition, very, very hard to read, I think, right now in the American case, or even in some of the European cases that we've discussed. It's easy to mix up short-term and longer-term patterns and try to overstate their potential significance 4 or 5 years down the road.
Jan, you want to jump in?
I very much agree with this assessment. I would say that in Eastern Europe, one thing that is changed possibly forever, or at least for the foreseeable future, is the understanding that immigration politics will play a role. And this is very new. That wasn't there before. There is a very positive side to that realization. That realization means that Eastern European countries are actually relatively prosperous, relatively stable part of the European Union in general. They are actually places where migrants want to come, or potentially want to come. That is a good thing for Eastern Europeans to realize, that they've actually overall done very well over the last 25 years, and that they belong to the most affluent and stable countries in the world. At the same time, it's obviously going to create the types of backlashes and the types of populist and potentially xenophobic politics that we're seeing. And these politics will now be more present in Eastern Europe vis-a-vis immigrants than they have been in the past.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I think that every country is different. For example, in Spain, well, there are something that we know for sure. That is, in some countries, some traditional parties has collapsed. For example, the Socialist Party in Greece has almost disappeared and is not going to change at least for a while. And in Spain, for example, we know by the polls that the political identity of Podemos, for example, is really strong. They have a very strong base and very loyal base. They are not going to disappear in the future. They are not going to disappear easily. And another thing is that these new parties have put in the political agenda and in the public discussion some new topics. We have been talking about immigration, for example. Globalization is another hot topic that in the campaign in the United States, but in Brexit campaign also, for example, the trade agreements has been in the discussion. And in the case of the United States, I think that this is maybe the most important thing, but because maybe Trump will lose the election. But this million of voters that feel that they can talk about things that in the up to date they couldn't talk or to be proud of, they will stay. And these millions of voters feeling differently and feeling with more political power with some topics, and they will stay. And it will change the political agenda of the political landscape.
So following up on that, we have a question from the audience, whoever would like to take this. Does the fact that Trump seems to have hit a ceiling in the polls reflect the fact that protest voters in the U.S. may have been turned off by some of his controversial statements and are now looking elsewhere to voice their protest?
I'll take a shot at that. Partly because I was emphasizing electoral systems before in some of our discussion about different countries. And of course, the American electoral system is the most unusual of all, in the sense that you have the presidency and only two parties really that are able to contest it effectively. So while there are other actors out there, like the Libertarian and Green candidates, they are not very well positioned to make much impact in the electoral results. So they're not nearly as well positioned as protest parties are in some of the European cases to pick up 10 or 15 or 20% of the vote. So therefore, the choices that Americans face now between a Democratic and a Republican candidate who is unacceptable to many people are difficult, because what do you do if you want to try to register a protest, and a protest against who? And you can either throw your vote away, or not vote, or vote for Trump. And the alternatives that are presented to voters in other electoral systems that we've been discussing are simply not there. So you're going to get a different dynamic, and you're going to get some strange outcomes. I'm interested, for example, in what happens to turnout, because I could see turnout being quite depressed in this election compared to the previous election, if enough disaffected Republicans simply don't show up. And that has not only consequences for the outcome, it has consequences for the party system, since the lower turnout is among more mainstream Republicans, the more damage that's going to do to the party at the not just in Congress but also at the state and local level. So the election, because of the odd voting patterns, could well turn out to be a huge disaster for the Republican Party.
And really, we could say that the best form of protest is exit, right? Is actually not voting, right? And so in the U.S. context, as you just mentioned, right, there are not so many different options, right? There's the libertarian, the green option, but those are not necessarily viable options like we see in small parties in other countries. So really, what voters in the U.S. have as a way of protesting is, as you said as well, is to not vote. Yeah, and I agree that it'll be interesting to see what turnout numbers look like among different groups in the population, given the uniqueness of this election.
Well, at least what we know now, I saw three days ago more or less, is that the people undecided, the people who have decided to vote but doesn't have decided yet who are they going to vote, are double than in another elections.
Well, it does not look like we have any other questions from the audience unless anyone is coming in. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, are there any last-minute comments from anyone? I think we've covered a lot of very interesting things and have left lots of things open to think about for sure.
Yeah.
But thank you to our three guests. This has been a great discussion, and really appreciate your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.